Hi, everybody. Welcome to our last Caribbean Studies seminar of the semester. And thank you to everybody who's joined us at the past few sessions. We've had a really, really great time. Please do look out for our upcoming seminars, which are starting at the end of January. They're all online now, and I'll share the link in the chat with you so that you can sign up for that. And also, I'd just like to say thank you also to the Society for Caribbean Studies who've been supporting us in putting these seminars together. And without further ado, then I'll pass over to our chair for today, Oliver, who is going to lead the session for you.
Thanks, Eve. All right, well, welcome everyone to today's session, Hauntings of Island Sovereignties, an examination of Curaçao and Trinidad and Tobago's response to the Venezuelan migration crisis. I'll now introduce our two distinguished speakers. I'll begin with Natalie Dietrich Jones, who's a research fellow at the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies at the University of the West Indies Mona campus. Her interests include geographies of the border, governance of migration, and intra-regional migration in the Caribbean. Natalie is chair of the Migration and Development Cluster, an interdisciplinary group of researchers exploring contemporary issues concerning migration in the Caribbean and its diaspora. Natalie holds an MPhil in Development Studies from the University of Cambridge and a PhD in Development Policy and Management from the University of Manchester. She's currently undertaking a multi-sited project on the response to the Venezuelan migration to small island developing states in the Southern Caribbean. And Shiva S. Mohan is a human geographer with research interests situated at the interface of migration and mobility studies, island studies, and political geography. His work seeks to underscore the ambivalences, contradictions, and precarities within migrants' lived experiences, in addition to those faced by territories vis-a-vis transnational migrations. Shiva is a research fellow at the Canada Excellence Research Chair in Migration and Integration Program at Toronto Metropolitan University, where he leads two research projects as part of a Horizon Europe consortium, the Measuring Irregular Migration and Related Policies in the Canadian Context project, and a SALISES project investigating intergovernmentalism and firewalls. Shiva is a member of the Migration and Development Research Cluster at the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies, the University of West Indies. He's also an associated researcher and trustee with the Swiss-based NGO Environmental Mobility Research Unit. Well, it's a pleasure to serve as a chair, and I'll pick up after your presentations for the Q&A. So I'll hand it over to you two.
Okay, thank you, Oliver, and many thanks to Eve for extending the invitation to us to participate in the seminar. I'm going to talk about why we chose this in a bit, but just to say that I am happy to be doing this with Shiva, who I've been working with. I was trying to remember for about maybe 4 years now, Shiva. We've been collaborating on this topic. So thanks to CLACS for the invitation, and I hope that we do some justice to the topic that we have presented on screen. So just maybe one quick thing. Hurricane season ended last week, and it seems that they're removing the shuttles. I'm on campus. Are you hearing any disturbances, or am I okay? All right, but just bear with me if you do happen to hear anything in the background. Right. Okay, so this project, can you move to the next slide, please? Right, so we are going to approach this in 5 sections. I'm gonna go through the genesis and motivations for this project. I'm going to share, along with Shiva, some contextual information regarding our 2 case studies. As the previous slide indicated, we're looking at 2 small island developing states in the Southern Caribbean, which are currently experiencing a migration crisis. Then we're going to talk through our 3 key terms and explain the relevance to our paper. So we're going to discuss sovereignty, hauntings and ruination within the context of the management of the Venezuelan crisis. We wrote this paper in, I think the first iteration was 2020, and then we did a much later revision in 2023. And since that time, there's been some further evolutions. So we make some musings about what these emerging issues might mean for the crisis, and then we offer a conclusion. Next slide, please. Right. So the paper emerged out of reflections on the fieldwork experience that Shiva and I had doing very separate and distinct projects on Venezuelan migration to the Southern Caribbean. I, as was mentioned in the introduction, I'm focused on a multi-sited project. So I'm looking at Aruba, Curaçao, Guyana, and Trinidad and Tobago. And Shiva's work intersects based on his focus on Trinidad and Tobago. And where our work first had those connections was with a discussion around the experiences and challenges that we had undertaken qualitative research on undocumented migration to these different destinations. We were faced with a number of issues, primarily difficulties doing primary data collection through interviews. And so a lot of this work is grounded in critical discourse analysis, reflecting our analysis of newspaper articles, government documents, and speech acts by political elites and other officials of government. So we take a case study approach based on largely parallels, but also some distinctions between Curaçao and Trinidad and Tobago. And our paper bridges two related but distinct fields, which are political geography for Shiva and myself looking at migration studies. Next slide, please. Right. So we are oriented by these three key questions. What have been the policy responses of Curaçao and Trinidad and Tobago to an unanticipated and unprecedented large-scale migration increase? And when we talk about the context, we'll shed some light on what we mean by unanticipated and unprecedented. How has sovereignty impacted the state's execution of immigration policy? And are there any lessons to be learned for other Southern Caribbean states? And I would say broadly the Caribbean region, given what's happening now with similar geo-historical experiences. Next slide. So I'm going to begin with Curaçao, and I'm going to hand over to Shiva. But just to go back a second, go back. Right. So I'm going to start with Curaçao, and then I'm going to hand over to Shiva, who will focus on Trinidad and Tobago. Just in case we run out of time, we wanted to share one of our conclusions, our principal conclusions, which is that imperial debris have produced complex articulations and embodiments of sovereignty in Curaçao and Trinidad and Tobago as they seek to manage this Venezuelan migration crisis. And hopefully what that imperial debris is will become clear when we get into the discussion of our theoretical framework. And then we can move to the map. So for those who may not be aware of where we're situated geographically, this is not to scale, but it's just to give you an idea of where these countries are in relation to Venezuela. You can see Trinidad and Tobago to the far right, below Grenada. So nearer to Sucre, and then Aruba, Curaçao, and Bonaire closer to Falcon. This matters because the proximity is one of the key issues influencing the current migratory pathways, especially those that are maritime related movements. But one of the things that's important to bear in mind is that on a very clear day, you can actually see Venezuela from either Trinidad and Tobago or Curacao, based on how near these countries are to the coast of Venezuela. So next slide, please. So the crisis which we're referring to as the Venezuelan migration crisis emerged in 2014. Mohan, whose PhD research examined the migratory phenomena post 2014, he refers to these as the Maduro migrations because they largely emerged with the transition in government to Maduro after Hugo Chavez would have passed away. And a lot of destabilization was happening in Venezuela at the time, declining economy, shrinking resources, being invested in like social care, so poor health systems and so on. And that pushed people away from Venezuela, which was historically a country of immigration. And some authors like Vargas indicate that it became a country of emigration, with as many as 7.8 million people having left since 2014, making this crisis the largest displacement crisis globally today. So it has widely impacted the region of the Americas, not to as great an extent the Southern Caribbean. But the reason that the Southern Caribbean is significant is that relative to their size, they have been the most impacted by the crisis. So if you press again, Eve, just to bring up this newspaper clipping, in 2018, the UNHCR commissioner at the time had indicated that the crisis was so significant, it was on the scale of Syria, based on how small these countries are and how extended they were in trying to craft a response to the crisis. And so we're going to give some further contextual information to explain why this was the case. As I said, I'm going to start with Curacao, and then I'm going to hand over to Shiva to look at Trinidad and Tobago. You can move to the next slide, please. Right. So for this paper, one of the key characteristics we need to bear in mind is this enduring colonial relationship between Curaçao and what is referred to as the Kingdom of the Netherlands. This is a very complex relationship. If I gloss over some things, it's only in the interest of time, and we can further develop it during the Q&A. But essentially, the Dutch Caribbean was colonized later on in the 18th century by the Netherlands, after having passed through several hands, as many of the countries in the region have. And in 2010, the Curaçao and Bonaire Curaçao and Saint Martin went through a process of transition to autonomy. So rather than being colonies, they were now part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, operating as autonomous countries, along with Aruba, which had gone through that process earlier in 1986, and then the country of the Netherlands itself. So the Kingdom of the Netherlands is actually a unique federal model, if we think of it in political science terms, because it has countries based both in Europe and the Caribbean region. And this has implications for border management because the countries which are in the Caribbean are also part of this European border geography and landscape, and it has implications for how borders are managed. So if you think back to that map that we would have projected earlier, Curaçao is a small island developing state. It is only, although it is the largest of the Dutch Caribbean countries, it is only 444 square miles. And the distance to the coast of Venezuela is only 60 kilometers or 40 miles, right? So very close to Venezuela. In fact, in the 15th up to about the 17th century, Aruba, Bonaire, Curaçao, and Falcon and Lara, which you see on the map there, were actually ruled as one under Spain. So even though the emphasis for the paper is on the colonial relationship with the Dutch, this legacy of the relationship with Spain in terms of what eventually evolved into a relationship with Venezuela is also important for consideration. And in terms of them being so close, historically there has been this their operation as a place or spaces of refuge. So in the past, Venezuelan revolutionaries would have sought asylum in both Aruba and Curacao. And so there's this legacy of refuge, despite what we argue today about the restrictive nature of the policy landscape in terms of managing this migration crisis. So if we could go back to the slides on context, just the second one for Curacao, right? So this historical relationship with Venezuela is manifest today in the operation of a refinery in Curacao. I believe based on the last thing that I read that the lease had ceased, and I think there were discussions about a company from China taking over this lease. But essentially, Curacao is very dependent on the relationship with Venezuela, irrespective of who operates the refinery, because it is oil from Venezuela that is being refined in Curacao. And they are also heavily dependent on the tourism sector. Venezuelan tourists were as much as, I think, a third of the market in Curacao at one point in time. This is pre-COVID figures. So this relationship with Venezuela commercially is very important. And then with the onset of the crisis, we saw a shift in demography where Venezuelans became the larger proportion of migrants resident in Curacao, outstripping other Latin American nationalities, which were like Colombians and Dominican persons from Dominican Republic. And this had implications for integration of migrants. There was a report in 2014 about how migrants could be integrated well into Curaçaoan society, given the Afro-descended, the dominance of the Afro-descending population and the appearance of people wanting to take jobs away from local Curaçaoans. So I'm going to hand over to Shiva, who's going to talk about Trinidad, talk more about our theoretical framework. And then we'll do some concluding remarks about what we mean by hauntings in terms of future negotiations of migration crisis. Over to you, Shiva.
Yes. Thanks so much, Natalie, and thanks again to the organizers. Just bear with me. I just sat here and I got a headache. I don't know why, where that came from, but I think I'll be all right. Um, so, as Natalie stated, I'll be dealing with the Trinidad and Tobago case study in this research exercise. And just to give you a little bit of background of Trinidad and Tobago, like Natalie did, in relation to Venezuela and what's happening in the contemporary moment. So Trinidad, the full name is the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. It's a republican nation. It's an independent nation as well in 1962, I believe. Um, and there are certain dimensions of the historical experience that is produced and reproduced in the present day, which has come to serve as characterizations of Trinidad and Tobago. So, in terms of the neo-colonial element, we see Trinidad as we could use the example of its migration policies, which we argue are deeply influenced by colonial legacies. So these colonial instruments that led to exclusion and limitations and delimitations sort of reproduced themselves in the present day management style or governance style of migration in Trinidad, which sees a privileging of or shoring up of autonomy or self-determination by the Trinidad and Tobago government over collaboration or human rights obligations, right? To further those human rights obligations. Geographically, Trinidad and Tobago is just 8 miles off the coast of Venezuela. And as Natalie said, on a clear day, you can see the coastline of Venezuela. And Natalie has also written about this geography, and she's conceptualized the idea of the Venezuela Trinidad and Tobago migration corridor to bring together or to define or to reflect the long history of interterritorial mobilities and movements between Trinidad and Tobago and Venezuela. Historically, there's even the suggestion that Trinidad functioned as a refuge for revolutionaries from Venezuela. So there's been a historical movement of people. There's been a historical movement of knowledge. There's been a historical movement of resources, and that holds true for the contemporary moment, where the relationship between Trinidad and Venezuela are quite reciprocal. In addition to that, that economic relationship, there's a geo-economic and geo-historical relationship between the two territories. But Trinidad, like Venezuela, is an oil economy. It's a one commodity economy, and so the very drop in oil prices over the past few years that impacted Venezuela in such a negative way also impacted Trinidad and Tobago. And in addition, given the instability in Venezuela and the U.S. sanctions on Venezuela, that has also impacted the connection between the two countries, and we'll talk about that in a little. While it's strained the energy relationship, it's also shrunk the tourism sector, which has further strained the economy as well in Trinidad. And as a result, one can argue that these pressures have contributed to Trinidad and Tobago's reduction in capacity to manage a large-scale migratory episode like the Venezuelan displacement crisis. Trinidad demographically, the last I recall, it was 1.4 million people. And some of the numbers initially, when this crisis started to unfold, some of the numbers that were being thrown out were ranged from 40,000 people to 60,000 people. I think that, in fact, that was the number thrown out by the UNHCR, and that would have represented about 4 to 5% of the island's population. So, again, coming back to the point of what Natalie was making earlier about the scale of the episode in relation to mainland territories, for instance, it is quite significant, it is quite substantial, and it's quite consequential as just like Venezuela, Trinidad's migration profile has also shifted from largely known as a sending nation to now receiving these inflows of migrants. In addition to these Venezuelans coming to Trinidad, it has also placed, according to the state, strains on public infrastructure, but also it has impacted societal attitudes towards migrants. So, for example, there was one point in time where you'd have Venezuelans coming over to Trinidad to train human resources around in the oil and gas sector, and they were well respected, well respected individuals. And now that we've noticed that relationship has shifted substantially. Can you shift the slide? Yep. Okay, so we talked about this. Sorry. The next one. So this is where we enter into the sort of framing of what kind of conceptual groundings we decided to engage to help us understand and analyze what we were witnessing in these case studies. And so we decided to look at the instruments that the government was using, and it appeared to be this its strength, right? It depended on its strength, and it depended on its autonomy and its degree to self-determine how it approaches the situation. And in conceptually, sovereignty is a problematic concept, and it means different things in different contexts, and are informed by different historical experiences. And there have been many Caribbean authors who've written on the subject, but specifically, we can make this broad statement that's plastered on the slide here, that in the Caribbean, sovereignty takes on many layers due to degrees of autonomy, issues of territorial integrity arising from border disputes, challenges of border management related to islandness and or scarce resources, as well as countries' positionality, right, in relation to the present day powers. And we sort of there's no real sort of standard definition for what sovereignty does, but there are elements that we can draw on to frame how sovereignty is launched in the Caribbean context, especially in small island developing states, where there is this kind of limited view, traditional notions of what sovereignty is attached to territorial limitations, territorial bordering, territorial autonomy, that sort of thing. There are academics who have written about the reluctance of Caribbean people, and we could talk about political leaders who are hard pressed to give up, for example, their right to make certain decisions, even in something as simple as trying to advance regional integration, for instance, right?
Maybe just to add, Shiva, about So we lean on this, despite this ambiguity of the term sovereignty, the traditional Westphalian perspective, in terms of the capacity of the state to manage its borders and so on. But that was problematic for us because this traditional view, which embraces a unitary state, as we argue in the paper, is not necessarily what obtains in our context because of the different contextual issues. So for you, for example, in Trinidad, we had emphasized the fact of ethnic divide and racialized politics, which undermines the unitary nature of the state. And then certainly in the context of in Curaçao, where the country is still it's not considered a colony, but it is a non-independent country and still very heavily dependent on a metropole state, whether it can in fact be considered sovereign. But what we were reflecting on in the paper is the degree to which these two countries with very different experiences of colonialism exercise governance in the migration policy space within the context of this crisis, which I think you will elaborate on in the next couple slides.
Yes, thanks so much, Natalie. And yes, this is how we did in fact operationalize our understandings of sovereignty, the degree to which, because of the difference in the governance structures and systems of both countries. So if you could switch slides now, I think. Yes. Okay. So hauntings and ruination, and so we needed to find an analytic or analytics plural to gain an understanding or to ground sovereignty as we were launching it in this research exercise. And what we observed or what we called upon was the history of the pervasive history of the Caribbean region, where colonial and imperial experiences were reproducing themselves in the everyday, in the contemporary period, right? In islands, modern day political systems and the economic systems and the social systems. It's something that we can't get away from. These vestiges, as they were called in the literature, there were two terms to represent these vestiges, and that was haunting and ruination. And we looked at previous authors who engaged the terms hauntings and ruination, and we looked at Scholes, who suggested that haunting is a grasp the ongoing presence of the colonial past after the formal end of empire. And Gordon, he uses haunting as a verb to reflect the functions in everyday life, where oppressive forces are assumed to be historically over and done with. And then more specifically in the context of migration governance, Mounts, in her discussion of offshore border enforcement, uses haunting as an analytic to explain the mobility of sovereign power in spaces where the state may appear absent, right? Push it outside of their borders. So basically, the amalgam of these three perspectives, we sort of concluded that it was haunting would be a sort of ethereal and a pervasive expression that configures how sovereignty is launched. So, for example, in Trinidad, we could see that that, as I mentioned before, that the approaches to migration are reproduced in its in the laws and in the books. Um, just give me one sec. Then we engaged the concept of ruination, where we sought to the idea or the object behind the study was to analyze the tangible manifestations of government action, which meant policy, and also pronouncements that they made um, on how they treated with the migration episode. Ruination in this instance is a material or process-driven manifestation, and this really is the analytic is launched in a way to show how um, the sorry, I'm losing my train of thought here. Natalie, can you jump in for a second?
Sure. Right. So we use draw on feminist geography a lot in the paper. As Shiva was mentioning, Mounds is one of the scholars that we reflect on in terms of this concept of ruination. And essentially it's almost equivalent to haunting in the sense that it's connecting past and future. But if I could just read what we have in our paper. So ruination is launched as material process driven manifestation. Concerned about the reflection of power imbalance and oppression in actual material processes and structures, including migrants' bodies, but also sites of regulation of the border. Could I ask you to move to the next slide, please? Right. So maybe one of the things to point to, because I'm seeing a little gap in terms of what we presented, is that both Curaçao and Trinidad and Tobago are ruins of empire. I think it comes up later, but I think it might be important to clarify now. So they're both ruins of empire in their experience of colonialism. But what we want to emphasize here is how that experience of colonialism has shaped the response to the crisis, as reflected in the deficit migration governance structures and frameworks. So we glossed over a bit in the context the fact that both these countries do not have adequate policy frameworks to respond to either a general migration crisis or, more specifically, a crisis related to persons seeking asylum. Trinidad and Tobago was actually discussed in the past as like a model country because it had drafted a policy to respond to refugees, but that policy never took effect. And so there is nothing really to guide on the ground how the country should be addressing a migratory crisis or a refugee crisis. Despite the fact that Trinidad and Tobago has signed, because they argue they have not ratified, but signed the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees and the 1967 Protocol. That makes it very different from Curaçao, which has not signed either the convention or the protocol, and it has no policy framework in place to respond to the crisis. And when at its height, we had shared that it started in 2014. at its peak in around 2017, 2018, there was a lot of discussion on the ground in both countries. But for Curacao, for example, their government had actually, well, representatives of their government had indicated that they were beyond capacity. And if they were to provide asylum, they could only do so for about 500 people. In terms of estimates, 6,000 Venezuelans are undocumented in Curacao, and altogether about 30, well, to date, 33,000 Venezuelans in Aruba and Curacao, um, making up a sizable portion of the population, about 10% in Curacao. So the issue here, in terms of us stressing hauntings and ruination, is in both these countries, which are in a space that is hypermobile, that is in a space that was crafted through forced mobility, that relies very heavily on mobilities generally in terms of the movement of force, for example, movement of goods. We spoke about oil earlier, that there is no framework in place to address migration. So this is a deficit that's largely attributed to the process of colonization, but not necessarily only to that. Because there are other contextual factors that we highlighted earlier that signal why this policy gap has not necessarily been rectified. The primary one being there are two small island developing states that have very limited resources, and some would argue that is itself a relic of colonialism, but very limited resources, institutional wise, but also in terms of human resources and the financial capacity to address a migratory crisis. So as it says there on the slide, migration governance is mediated through these perversive historical notions of sovereignty that have inherently configured the capacity and latitude of interventions in this specific crisis. And as the second bullet points out, so we are emphasizing these constrained public policy maneuvers and other interventions, especially in the face of external actors calling for further action. So the contest of sovereignty has to do not just with state engagement with their formal metropoles, but with actors in international migration governance like UNHCR, like IOM, and even local actors that have emerged that are pushing the state towards a particular course of action, which would be to have a more positive response to the migration crisis. I think on the next slide, it says there's a restrictive policy environment. So despite their very different history, they share, this is Curaçao and Trinidad and Tobago, parallels in migration management, which are largely characterized by a restrictive policy environment. And Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, they've been very vocal, and international press houses very vocal in terms of criticizing the governments about their restrictive approach. And when we say restrictive approach, we're referring to the practice of interdictions at sea, as well as an extensive deportation agenda. In COVID, persons were being deported from Trinidad and Tobago and Curaçao back to Venezuela because of this highly restrictive policy environment. So I'm gonna pause. You're okay now, Shiva? If you
Yeah.
can continue.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thanks.
If you
Mohan.
want to. All right, go ahead.
Yeah, in addition to these policy developments, Trinidad also, for the first time in its history, with Venezuela, implemented a visa regime, now requiring Venezuelans to get a visa in Caracas if they were desirous of heading to Trinidad. Can we switch to the slide, please? So basically, the slide talks about the developments of what was going on in what was and continues to be the key things that are happening in Trinidad at present. So in 2019, after a very long time of protracted silence by the state, not even acknowledging that something was happening in Venezuela. So this started in 2014, first policy move in 2019. So for all that time, the Trinidad and Tobago government continued with its economic relationship, full steam ahead, with the Venezuelan government, who they determined and kept was Nicolas Maduro and his colleagues. They developed what they call the migrant registration framework, which basically is a labor permit exempt policy. And what this did was it provided I guess you could call it an amnesty for Venezuelans to present themselves and to the state or the ministry to be screened. And when I say screened, I mean to ensure that you do not have a criminal record, for example. Because if you did, then that would make you a criminal, and so there was grounds for deportation in that instance. And how they would find this out is by communicating with Interpol to figure out if their name was on some list or whatever the case is. But that in itself is fraught in a situation where people are moving because of an acute situation, right? I'm just saying that as a side note. So this temporary migrant registration framework was initially geared as a labor exempt policy for 6 months. And then after 6 months, and they were issued cards, identification cards, and after the Venezuelans who qualified. And after 6 months, this was renewed, and a further 6 months, and a further 6 months, up between 2019 and right now at present, it's been being renewed on this in these increments. So what this suggests, well, first off, what it suggested was an official account by the government, which sort of shifted things in their position when they were like, we can't possibly have 40 or 60,000 Venezuelans in Trinidad because 50,000 is the population of Tobago, the smaller of the two islands. So how can we have that population in Trinidad? They did not see that made sense. And so they counted, on that first occasion, they counted approximately 15 to 16,000 Venezuelans. A significant departure from what was being put out in the discourse. Second to that, what this temporary policy continues to do, is to place Venezuelans in this lovely, neat category of economic migrants, totally disregarding their real motivations to move on, which are obviously complex and mixed, and not representative of the true situations that Venezuelans have been facing. And third to this, what it suggests is the temporariness of the situation, where government refuses to engage in any sort of substantive advancement in either an updated migration policy or to articulate domestic laws to activate the protections in the 51 Convention, right? So that is this temporary framework covers all of these things, and obviously to the advantage of, or to put the government in a sort of superior position here. But I've been thinking about this, and I interpreted this temporary policy going on for so long as a wait and see kind of situation. I mean, earlier when the situation in Venezuela dominated the news media, this is the idea I had, that the government was waiting to see. Because based on some interviews with some migrants themselves, they were suggesting that things would change and they would go back home. So we don't exactly know what the decision was based on, premise that this temporary policy was based on, rather than looking at something that's more substantive. But this is what obtains in the present day. Deportation, as Natalie has alluded to earlier, continues to be one of the key sort of mechanisms for the government to regulate and control Venezuelans' presence in Trinidad and Tobago. But I must also hasten to say that there is a voluntary repatriation framework that also exists alongside the deportation that is happening. And initially, when this came on stream, it was actually Venezuela's planes that were coming to the Piaco International Airport to extract people voluntarily, quote unquote, from Trinidad. In addition to that, there's been increased surveillance of the western border, and everything that surrounds securitization of migration in this same sense.
Sorry to interrupt, Shiva, but we're reaching the hour, so if you could wrap up. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. I think what would the other slide say?
The further musings about the new.
Oh, further musings. So
Mhm.
as Natalie said, we crafted this paper many in a circumstance that's totally different from what's happening now. I think we could use the sort of temporal demarcator as the pandemic. So pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, and what we've been seeing. One, I sort of said it before, but the only real productive advancement that's been taken by the government is to allow students, Venezuelan students specifically, to enter the public school system. Now, not all of the Venezuelan students, but there is a specified number of them that can enter the school system, where previously churches were running parallel education systems for these students. And there's a third point that's happening, and with the Trump's second presidency, the sanctions that were sort of that was lifted to facilitate a drug and gas deal, a gas deal between Venezuela and Trinidad. There's a threat of it now being disbanded, or the permissions taken away because of the Trump presidency. And of course, we have a general election that's coming up, where migration is now being reinvigorated as a hot button sort of political issue. I think I'll leave it there. Sorry, Natalie, for eating up your time there.
Okay. I'll just go through this slide, and then after this, Eve, maybe to just skip to the conclusion, and we can talk about the other things in the Q&A. So, in terms of renation in Curacao, because of the continued relationship with the Kingdom of the Netherlands, what Curacao and the rest of the Dutch Caribbean has tried to do is to request assistance from the Kingdom government to support with management of the crisis. Still on that slide, Eve, go back, please. Yeah, right. And they have actually, this is the local governments in the respective countries have argued that it is the Kingdom government that should take charge of the crisis. And there's been this back and forth, and what I call in other discussions a contest of responsibility over management of the crisis. What the Kingdom government has done is provide funds to support beefing up of the the facilities, the detention facilities that hold detained migrants, rather than try to advance policy and institutional mechanisms that would support migrants' human rights. So they've actually strengthened detention, strengthened detection. They've spent money on drones, spent money on beefing up the interdiction through the naval, the Coast Guard. And I think that sort of mirrors, which is one of the things that we argue in the paper, this restrictive approach mirrors the practice in the metropole states, further underscoring this issue about the hauntings relating to sovereignty. The other thing is that Curaçao remains a non-signatory state. I've just completed a whole paper on why this is the case within the context of a decolonial framework. But essentially, Curaçao remains non-signatory to the convention. And although its decision not to become a signatory can be seen as a sovereign move, it undermines a potentially a move that could potentially enhance the rights of migrants in Curaçao. So I'm just you can skip all the other slides. We get to the end. Skip, because we had some stuff to share, but we can talk about these in the end, right? So this imperial debris we refer to means that the two countries are haunted by a weak migration and refugee governance framework, limited institutional capacity, and then dependence on metropole states to manage crises. And while it would, based on their behavior, while sovereignty might be best manifested in their own autonomous actions to manage the crisis, it may actually be in their own interest to cede some of that sovereignty to collaborate with other states or with organizations in order to more effectively manage the crisis. So we're going to stop there. And hopefully the questions that emerge will touch on some of those things we didn't get to cover in those other slides. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Shiva and Natalie, for your presentation. It was very, very interesting. And there was a lot of material in there, including a very interesting theoretical framework that I think has left us all with things to ponder on. So I'd be interested to see if there are any questions from the audience. And if not, I will begin with some of many points that I have laid out and already thought about. But let's see. I see Sam has unmuted himself. Is that
Yes.
preparation for a question?
Yes, that's right. Thank you so much, Oliver. But a massive thank you to both Natalie and Shiva for taking the time and for sharing your in-depth knowledge with us today. Just had a question to understand, is there anything that you've uncovered in your research that might be linked to almost like state-sponsored migration? Was there anything whereby countries, political parties may have been trying to influence the migration of one particular group over another, either positively or negatively?
So I'm gonna answer in a like indirect way. I hope that what I say is clear. So this issue about state-sponsored migration, I think, has more relevance to Guyana. Shiva, you agree with that? Because there is a border dispute between Guyana and Venezuela, and it's alleged that, we're careful to say that, Venezuelans are being encouraged to move into Guyana to strengthen Venezuela's claims to the Essequibo territory, which it says that it rightfully belongs to Venezuela and not to Guyana. Guyana has been openly receiving Venezuelan migrants, notwithstanding, but there was concern when I did a research project about 3 years ago in terms of the way that politics might be swayed with these new Venezuelans living in Guyana. Maybe the flip side to that is in terms of voting of migrants. Curaçao has allowed for political campaigning for Venezuelan candidates in Curaçao in the past. There is actually Venezuelans living in Curaçao can register to vote in Curaçao for Venezuelan elections. I guess that's a different way to look at their political participation. So that's how I would address that question. I don't know if Shiva wants to add anything.
Well, I think there's a lot of gray area around what state-sponsored migration might mean. So, for example, going back to the point of the border dispute between Venezuela and Guyana, a majority, as far as I'm aware, the last I've heard, a majority of the people who Venezuelans who have gone into Guyana fully are in fact people who are from indigenous populations, and they straddle the border between both Guyana and Venezuela. So they ask them who they identify with, wherever they end up, in which geography, right? Geographical context. In terms of political participation, and just because there's an upcoming general election in Trinidad, and all of a sudden, so after, let's say, the end of the pandemic in 2001, and we've had the other sort of upheavals in different parts of the world where media sort of shifted attention from Venezuela to these other episodes. Things sort of settled, in my opinion, and okay, settled in quotation marks. Venezuelans in Trinidad sort of became part of the mosaic, then, if you want to call it that. And it's only now, because the election heat is building, and so I've noticed that the all themes are recurring. They're coming back out into the public domain, and obviously this is to energize a certain kind of discourse, right, around Venezuela. So I think in that regard, and you have the textbook arguments of, oh, but they're going to get an ID, they can vote, that sort of thing, right? So yeah, in that regard, that's how that plays out.
I had a question, but I can't raise my hand. Is it okay, Oliver?
Yes, go ahead. Mhm.
Yeah. So my question was really about the intervention of foreign governments, really, in terms of their influence over what's happening regionally. So obviously the Dutch in Curaçao, and possibly the British or the US and Canada in Trinidad and Tobago. But ultimately, for example, what are they funding? Because I know that in my own research, following the funding does open a lot of questions, really, in terms of where foreign interests lie and kind of what power dynamics there are. So specifically in terms of, you mentioned the Coast Guard, but also in terms of, the army, or even detention centres and what have you. And also thinking more globally about the influence then of certain governments over, where they sit, basically. So in terms of the influence over the IOM and the UNHCR. So what influence, if any, do kind of foreign powers have? Because I think then that links really well to obviously your observations about kind of colonial overtones and how that is very much embedded within kind of political structures. And then the second question to tag on to that is asking about the SIDS agenda as well, because I know there was the recent meeting, a regional global but anyway, recent meeting on SIDS to address kind of the kind of priorities of SIDS and where this is heading. So how do you foresee then this playing out in terms of that dialogue and those efforts to address kind of the very specific needs of small island developing states within and beyond the Caribbean?
So maybe to start with the second question first. I was lucky enough to attend SIDS, but only for a couple of days because I went to Canada for another Latin American and Caribbean Studies conference. Migration was not very center of agenda at SIDS. It was included, but more so within the context of climate change and human mobility, within the context of what is referred to as human mobility within the context of climate change, and a whole discussion around whether how states would manage, would it be planned relocation, what kind of migration policies they can put into place. So this type of discussion more broadly around the migratory crisis, and if we can think, for example, of Haiti and what is happening in Haiti, that was not on the agenda at all at SIDS. SIDS kind of emerged as an environmental conference, so it's kind of understood why. Where the conversation I think has been more vocal is maybe at OAS level and CARICOM, but much earlier on. I'm not really seeing as much conversation now around the management of crisis migration, although CARICOM is currently developing a migration policy, which is supposed to incorporate a response or an approach towards the management of migratory crisis. So that's the second question.
Sorry, just quick. That was in Antigua and Barbuda, right? It was in Antigua.
Yes.
Right.
Mm-hmm. In May, June of this year. Right. So for the first question in terms of the intervention, so we're a little bit constrained with the paper. We do touch a bit on the role of the US, only a little bit. I don't know if you were aware, for example, that the US and the EU had collaborated to give aid to Venezuela, and they actually used Curaçao as the base for which to ship the aid, and it caused such a kerfuffle. Venezuela closed the borders with the Dutch Caribbean, and it had long-lasting ripple effects, the most significant one being the movement of people, because it affected air travel more than it did maritime travel. But then also commercial wise, because Curacao got a lot of its agricultural produce from Venezuela. There was actually a floating market in the capital city. So they would come regularly from Venezuela, set up at the ports and sell goods. That floating market, which was over 200 years old, basically disappeared when the border was closed, because the border was closed for maybe 3 years. It just reopened last year, and the floating market came back, I think they said in March of this year. So a 200-year-old institution impacted by a decision of the US and EU to ship aid through Curaçao. But as you rightly say, we're still a very colonial geography. There are military bases in these countries still operated by the US. Who knows what else is happening that's not publicized, you know what I mean? So I don't know if Shiva, you want to add anything to that?
Well, I have a few examples about like US interventionism, even in this moment, in the more recent moment, and I'm not talking about like Maurice Bishop and those kinds of things, but what it shows to us is that the US under Trump was using the sort of old geopolitical handbook, while the outward CARICOM stance was a position of non-interference and non-intervention in Venezuela. There was a moment, I can't remember which year, maybe it was 2019, where Trump invited just a segment of CARICOM to his place in Mar-a-Lago. And, yep, Natalie?
No, I
I'm
was
sorry.
just saying Mar-a-Lago. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, sources have said that was he was trying to sort of change their minds and fracture the common position that CARICOM had, but it didn't necessarily work. I think this was around the time of one Guaido as well. But also in the Trinidad and Tobago context, in terms of the funding, for example, and perhaps we'll talk about this in a bit, about the actors that are involved in dealing with the Venezuelan migrants in these various contexts. It's not the government. It's not the state. It's the CSOs and the NGOs, right? It's that sector and the church, that sector that's shouldering the efforts. So, for example, I cannot. Maybe it was Red Cross. I can't remember the funding agency that's US based, that gave money, couple $1 million to Trinidad, and it came out the news of of the money coming in. It appeared, or it's sort of framed as if the agency gave the government the money, right? And instantly, the government put out a press release and had to call a news conference to say, no, look, the United States has given these bodies, the NGOs and CSOs, and not the government of Trinidad and Tobago. I interpret that as one way of saying, look, if you give us X resources, you can perhaps take away a bit of our autonomy, and it's an inroad for you to sort of dictate how we might proceed with managing things. Because this is not new. What was that kind of U.S. interventionism is not new, right? Through proxy.
Just
But
maybe one other thing, Shiva, with that, though we are not a refugee camp,
yes,
Rowley, just the Prime Minister in Trinidad, had actually made a statement to that effect. And it caused a huge rift between the government and UNHCR. In fact, I think the head of UNHCR had to leave. Not the head of UNHCR. Someone had to leave Trinidad. When that whole tension arose, because they were saying that these agencies were trying to force the government into a particular course of action and have it receive all these migrants when they did not have the capacity to receive them. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No.
It's
fine. I mean, just so succinctly, the government is in a situation in these contexts. They're in a situation where they are between giving up, degrees of their sovereignty or their right to self-determine in their minds, and their responsibility to protect. But if we look at Guyana, for instance, which some in some circles they call the gold standard of dealing with the situation, in large regard, they've invited the IOM and they've invited the UNHCR to articulate their course of action around managing migration.
But maybe the other dimension to that, Eve, is what we've observed, and we're hoping we can write something on this eventually, is the way that these new funding pathways have caused the emergence of local NGOs that did not previously exist, that have been able to address the needs of migrants that the state has not been addressing. Some are local. So in Curaçao, there's Human Rights Defense Curaçao. And then building on work that the church was doing in Trinidad, there are some new organizations. I think one is Venezuelan Women Migrants or something like that, that organization. So these have been instrumental in addressing the needs that the state has basically left unattended. But we also see some foreign agencies like HIAS, which is um, a Jewish agency. I think it's US funded. I'm not 100% sure, but that they operate in Aruba. Um, Also doing things like providing healthcare because they don't have access to healthcare in the public health system in the Dutch Caribbean, especially sexual and reproductive health care. So it's this question of funding. It might seem simple, but it's actually a very complex conversation because of the the details regarding who is operating in the space and what actions they're taking with respect to protection of migrants' rights.
Just to respond to that quickly, I think also the issue of the NGOization, right, of the
Yeah.
region, and the fact that I think we have to err on the side of caution and not see, you've got civil society and grassroots organisations, but you've also got local and international NGOs, many of which are not kind of these benign forces, but actually very much embedded within the structural, the system that is, of exclusion and of kind of this mistreatment of migrants and their really negative experiences. And you only have to look for the obvious example would be Haiti, right? And how that has kind of played out over the past 3 or 4 decades. Just to say that, there's a whole infrastructure here, right, of which there are various benefactors, some of which are very obvious, and some of which are very much in the kind of hidden, and not as clear, who are all benefiting economically from this economy, which is that of or the organization of migrants, basically.
Right. Agreed.
I wanted to ask a question, kind of bringing it down to some of the basic differences and similarities between the two islands.
Mhm.
And one of them is this linguistic and cultural similarity between Venezuela and Curacao and Venezuela and Trinidad and Tobago. Um, and I wonder, in your experiences and through your research, how that has come through, and if you think that might eventually lead to different policy results. And I specifically think about um, the Spanish-speaking migrants being able to work more easily in Curacao, perhaps, than in Trinidad and Tobago because of language barriers being smaller, for example. No, but I wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
So from my side, this is one of the key things I think needs to be addressed in terms of social integration of the migrants, which would be recognition of the certification that they take with them from Venezuela to these countries. This is one of the areas that's highlighted as a hindrance more so than language, because even where language is a barrier, for example, if they're seeking healthcare, there are persons who can interpret or provide interpretation. And migrants have actually said that language is less of a barrier than the recognition of their skills. Um, so yes, there is the bilingual issue in Curacao, and they can more easily, I think, navigate in Curacao than Trinidad. This is my my opinion. I don't know if Shiva would agree. But one of the things that we need to think about is maybe where they're working, and who they're providing services to. A lot of them are in the informal sector. That's one thing. Um, and so there is some exploitation there because of the language barrier, but more so to do with the fact that they're undocumented again, rather than that they don't speak the local language as well as a national of Trinidad and Tobago. Something I was gonna say, I was leading up to, right. So there are a lot of Venezuelan businesses in both Curacao and Trinidad and Tobago. So if they're employed in these businesses, is not such a big deal. It might be more of an issue when they try to seek work outside of the informal sector. Um, right. So outside of the informal sector, I think that's where the language barrier might be more of an issue.
Yeah, so, Venezuelans used to come to Trinidad to learn English, right? To learn the language, historically. Um, in the present day, I mean, there's so much influence of Venezuelan culture in Trinidad. There are whole communities on the southern part of the island that only speak Spanish, right? Um, uh, but a few years ago, under a different administration, the government policy was going to make Spanish as the second language of Trinidad, right? But with the change in administration, the change in government, that policy kind of fell off. And it was in recognition of how close countries like Venezuela, Spanish-speaking Venezuela, have been. I think by now that Venezuelans in Trinidad can speak to a degree that they can come across in an understandable way. But I don't know definitively. I can't say. Unlike if they're registered, they usually work in the formal sector. Well, they're recognized as formal employees in Trinidad with the ID card that they receive. But I don't know to what extent language would cause a problem. And we must also say, we don't have time to talk about it today, but we also have to talk about, like, what are the primary jobs that females, for instance, are driven into, or the stereotype around female Venezuelans, like what they engage in. Like, that sort of determines the extent to which communication is limited or expanded, right? But we can talk about that if we get invited back again.
Thanks. Yeah, these are very interesting questions, and comments and discussion in general, and it makes me also think of the different migration routes, right? Like when I visited Icacos like 2 years ago, and I did some interviews there with some of the kind of fresh migrants who had come from the Delta, and it was amazing because their stories seemed so different to kind of stories of people who come from Paria, who might be coming with different backgrounds, completely different, also ideas of what's waiting for them, what the end goal of migration is. But yeah, it's just a very interesting and complex situation, obviously, and there's this whole indigenous element, I think, that's also very interesting in the south of Trinidad, particularly. But I also wanted to think about the familiar connections that exist in both contexts, like these, as you say, well, Shivan, but also Natalie, this so interesting that these islands have been linked historically, like in an unbroken way. There's always been family movements and intermarriages, and there's always been business ties, and there's been constant movement. And you'll ask, most people will talk about an uncle or a great grandpa or whoever who's from Venezuela or in Venezuela, or that they have some uncles or nephews in Venezuela. And so I also think that's a very interesting kind of context to place this whole situation within, that these are really ultimately so closely tied, but also at the same time politically separate areas of the Caribbean. But I wanted to ask along those lines, because I thought it was so interesting that you talk about Trinidad and Tobago and Curacao as these ruins of empire. And I was wondering if you would consider including Venezuela itself into that category, and including it as a well, like another part of that analysis. Yeah.
I would, um, except that it would need to be qualified. So if we use core, periphery, semi-periphery, I think because of the ascendance that Venezuela had, because of the growth of its oil sector, it's somewhat different from Trinidad and Tobago and Curaçao, and it actually exercised some dominance, if you will, over the region, especially in CARICOM because of the Petrocaribe arrangement. So while we're alike in terms of that colonial experience, we were somewhat different because we were dependent on them in a similar way that we're dependent on the US or another metropole. So I do agree that they fall in the lens somewhat, but they're still distinguished based on the economic dominance that they had pre Maduro. That's how I would answer that. But maybe just a bit to the first part of what you mentioned about the unbroken links. This is what makes all of this so sad because historically we've had these long-standing ties, commercial ties, familial ties, dating back centuries, or Curacao going all the way back to the Amerindian period. And for now to have this type of response is very disappointing. I understand why it exists. And I think part of what I would want to articulate, I guess, as a solution for the crisis would be something that is kind of like a halfway in between. Okay, we can accept, how many can we accept? And if we're not taking all, who do we need to collaborate with to, respond to the needs that aren't being met? But yeah, I that's the part that makes it so sad for me because of this long historical legacy.
I just want to quickly say, because I know we're running out of time, just to bolster Natalie's point, is, small islands are just that. They are delimited pieces of land emerging from the sea. And so, in some regards, their resources are circumscribed, right? They're limited. But if you take an example like Colombia, where Venezuela, in Colombia's time of need, had opened its doors for the Colombian people, and it is said that Colombia has taken so many people in a sort of in a gesture to say, okay, in our time, you took care of us, we're going to take care of you in your time. And in the same way, Curacao and Trinidad, they've had these kinds of relationships before. So I agree with Natalie that it is unfortunate that governments are not even taking a small step to get something more substantive done. Rather, it's a hands-off approach, a very temporary approach. I'm assuming that things are going to see some kind of normalcy in Venezuela.
Well, thank you, Natalie and Shiva, one more time. I mean, I would really love to stay and talk, but we're just out of time. So let's give you one more round of applause, and thank you so much for sharing your very interesting research.